much is made of the fact that by 2027-28, India could emerge as the third largest economy in the world, overtaking Japan and Germany. How much of that would you attribute to the economic reforms, the policy measures undertaken by the Modi government in the last 10 years? And how much is just as part of an ongoing process that no matter which government is in power, India was growing earlier and will grow later? Because we have a big election coming.
Right.
And one of the aspects in that election will be how much of credit can the current government take for putting India on the growth path that it is right now?
Well, I think that one thing I do find quite remarkable about this government is that if you look at most governments in the past, and this is across the world, typically from an economic management standpoint, the first term tends to be when they carry out the big reforms. The second term is when you end up getting much more complacency and things ease off, right? This is a pattern we've seen even in countries like Russia and Turkey, where Putin and Erdogan first came to power. They were reformers who then ended up becoming much more of autocrats and status over time. The good thing I'll say about the current government is that a lot of the good decisions have in fact been taken in the second term rather than the first term. First term, in fact, I was, as you know, very critical of measures such as demonetization and the impact that had on the Indian economy and the kind of shocks that suffered from. The good thing that the current government has done, I think, is that more than just about reforms, it's about also not doing the bad things. And what do I mean by not doing the bad things? Like, one thing which I was completely against was for the government to go out and do some massive stimulus, as was being recommended by many people in 2020. Now, that would have just been completely irresponsible. And we saw the consequences in the developed countries as well, like the U.S., the kind of inflation that followed when you ended up doing that. And some of the emerging markets which did do massive stimulus in 2020, they did quite poorly after that because they had a lot of macroeconomic imbalances.
No, but the government was under a lot of pressure from leading academics, including some Nobel laureates, for not spending enough. And it doesn't typically get enough credit for being smart on economic management.
Yeah, but on this I was very clear. I mean, even back in 2020, and very vocal about it, and wrote about it as well, that we should have not done big stimulus, and I'm happy that we resisted from doing any big stimulus at that point in time. So that, I would say, was the good news as far as the government is concerned. But I think that's the history of India, which is that generally you find most governments do incremental reform. It's very difficult, given the socialist, I think, DNA of our country, for any government to carry out big bang reform unless you have your back to the wall. But now, even now, I mean, I just hope that there's so much of momentum currently behind the India story, but a lot now needs to come through in the actual numbers. Because if you look at the actual numbers, it's still a bit slow to move. I mean, look at the amount of foreign investment coming into the country, for example. Today, you have foreign direct investment in the country, which is just over 1% of GDP. Now, when China was booming, China was attracting FDI of 4% of GDP. Today, on average, other emerging markets attract about 2% of GDP in terms of foreign direct investment.
Why do you think India isn't getting more foreign direct investment at this moment, despite all the efforts the government has made?
Yes, I think that these things take some time to come through, but I think that there's more than, so there's foreign direct investment, and there's also, I think, a lot about how the domestic businesses are investing. Because if you look at India today, where is the investment boom? It's really happening on the government side. The government's rolling out massive infrastructure, and that's happening. But even private sector investment in India today hasn't really picked up.
So I want to spend some time on that, because one of the big hopes the government had when corporate taxes were slashed deeply was that this would kickstart a virtuous investment cycle. And then the pandemic happened, so that never really took off. We're now seeing some green shoots of private investment kicking in. Do you think that this could lead to a 5-7 year investment cycle that everybody's been talking about and hoping for? Or could this be just another flicker which doesn't turn into a big flame?
Well, with India, the line I've always said is that this is a country that's consistently disappointed the optimists and the pessimists. So I think that clearly the pessimists have been proven wrong. My hope now is that the optimists don't get proved too wrong as well, because there's a lot of gaudy optimism about India today, right? I mean, you can feel it everywhere. I think that what we now need are for the numbers to actually come through, And I think that in that regard, the government needs to do a bit more of introspection about why private investment is not picking up.
No, so you spend time on that. Why do you think that's the case?
So I think that one of the factors I do feel is that the state machinery needs to be reined in a bit. When I talk to some of the business people and stuff, the amount of power that like some of the investigative agencies, the tax authorities have in India today is extraordinary. Now you can argue that the government was trying to do that to specifically target a few people or target a few constituencies, but there are unintended consequences of it. That there is so much of the state needs to be reined in. If you look at the successful East Asian economies, they were very clear about having a very efficient state, which is that state like involvement in the economy, especially in this regard, kept being pulled back. Even in places like China, before Xi Jinping came to power, it's very clear that the private sector had a lot of room to run. I think this fear of, like I think that the term in India they use is iced in terms of, whether it's the income tax, CBI or ED being on your case. I think that is something which I think we need much more of streamlining and rationalization out there, because I think it's those kind of factors which I think play on the mind of businesses. Like one thing I had pointed out earlier is that we need a lot more of domestic businesses to stay in India. A data that I had analyzed back in 2018 was the number of millionaires leaving India. That number was like surging back then. Luckily, in the last couple of years, that number has sort of stabilized. So we need more signs of domestic businesses wanting to stay in India and foreign investors also feeling that from the tax authorities and from the other agencies, they're getting a pretty good, fair and favorable treatment. And, because I think some of these things don't quite translate into bottom up, right? Which is that how should you have how on the ground is this all impacting things? Okay. And I think that is something which we don't quite sort of understand in India.